Okay, so welcome, and we're going to be doing part two of looking at Plato's Republic in terms of looking specifically at the role of a guardian. What is a guardian? How is a guardian cultivated, educated? What's his purpose? And how it reflects Plato's metaphysics and schema of the soul. Just to go over quickly, Plato's triad of the soul, for many people who will know, is reason, spirit, and desire, or reason, thymos and eros. But last time we looked at, so we're really focusing in on the spirited side of the soul, and how this is used in Plato to understand the role of a guardian. What is a guardian? And the becoming, of course, is all in the background of the kind of becoming or the emerging of the philosophy king, and how the philosophy king is philosophy ruler is cultivated, and its metaphysical groundings for how he sees the kind of there's kind of a psychology going on between the structure of the soul, which is reflected in the classes of a society. So you have the ruler, which is reflective of reason. You have the auxiliaries, who are reflective of spirit. They're the more militaristic part of the society, and you have the desire or appetite, which is reflective of the kind of more commercial aspect of the society, trade and so on. So last time, just to recap, we'll be going over anyway, but we looked at spirit and courage, and how spirit is, let's say, cultivated into courage, and this is very much resonates, you can see, in Aristotle with his golden mean, where he tries to get what is courage. Courage is something in between, and not necessarily in between in a kind of mathematical sense, but courage is something which makes possible the ability to not be totally reckless and impulsive without any reason at all, but to also not be a kind of totally meek, cowardly type. So courage is kind of somewhere, not necessarily in between, but it uses the spirit of impulsivity and aggression and so on, and gives it a virtuous form, which remains. It's not like repressed, or it's not ignored or uncultivated, but it's also not totally reckless. So that's very much in the last part one of how this guardian class is formed, and the relationship between spirit and reason is kind of crucial here, as we will see going into this section. So there's a quote here, and it is, and this form of education I'm talking about, not designed to one, or is it not designed to one train the body and the other the mind, except incidentally, but to ensure a proper harmony between energy and initiative on one hand and reason on the other, by tuning each to the right pitch. So we're talking about a kind of psychological and metaphysical harmony of the soul. Things aren't necessarily static in the soul. There's three different components which need to be ordered and harmonized and formed through certain forms of education. I do not mean education as in the modern conception of education, as in like you go to school and you do some exams. I'm talking about something much more radical. We're talking about something which involves kind of like a lifelong character building, challenges, trials, cultivating the cultivation of reason, of course, which Plato obviously goes through in having to do, mathematics, geometry, practicing dialectics, literature, and so on. I'm focusing more on how spirit is cultivated rather than reason. That's all important too, and that comes later on in the Republic. But the first about 5 books, maybe 6 books, even longer than that, is pretty much all focused on this spirited side of the soul and courage, and how it can be formed through education, and of course its role in the harmonizing and balancing of the soul, which all reflect each other. So you kind of have this energy. You kind of have in modern conceptions we might say something like nature or nurture, but you can think of it more like energy and cultivation, a balance between energy and cultivation. There's an energy which has the potential to be kind of idiotic and impulsive and reckless, but if it's cultivated right, it can be courage. You can't get rid of the energy, let's say. You can't simply repress it or say it shouldn't exist. This is kind of what Christianity did in a lot of ways. Like, pride comes before the fall. It kind of wanted to just ignore or get rid of this energy rather than give it form and cultivate it. So Plato's leadership and metaphysics. So trials seem to be directed at both challenges of overcoming the lure of pleasure. He uses witchcraft actually as a word. Well, I don't know, at least the translation in the text I have, which is I don't know where it is. It's Desmond Lee, I think, is the translator. Desmond Lee. So witchcraft is used as a word to describe the corruption of pleasure, the lure of pleasure, and of course fear. So these are 2 crucial things in Plato's Republic in which spirit is designed to overcome. Reason or desire cannot overcome these things. Only spirit can overcome these things. The lure of pleasure, at least reason on its own can't overcome these things. It needs spirit, right? So you have the lure of pleasure, and you could think, our kind of utilitarian, consumerist, late capitalist, whatever you want to call it, society is pretty much just completely overrun with this lure of pleasure and kind of a cheap, easy gratification and attention economies and so on, distraction, and also of fear. So education is basically aimed at cultivating this aspect of the soul which overcomes the corruption of fear and pleasure. This is a leadership principle as well, and this is not simply it's not simply a good. There's a kind of teleological basis to this. So we're not talking about like discipline and strength just for the sake of it or something. Just for the mere end of looking tough, stiff upper lip and all that. There's a metaphysical justification and grounding to this, which we will see. So he uses this. It's often known as Plato's noble lie, right? So, which is like basically the gold is the ruler, silver is the auxiliary or spirit, and bronze are the more manufacturing appetitive class. So this is known as basically the noble lie, where Plato describes that everyone is born with, excuse me if I don't get this completely correctly, but everyone is born with a kind of a kind of spirit which is kind of grounded in a balance of metals, precious metals. So everyone is a mixture of parts, we could say. But everyone also has a prevailing part. So this is often used as like a kind of justification for a social order. Very conservative argument. This person's kind of like essence or being is grounded in gold, therefore they're a ruler. Yours is bronze, therefore you can know your place and stay over there. This is the kind of cheap dismissal of this noble lie, which people often criticize Plato for. But I don't think this is exactly what it is. I think it's more complicated than that, right? Everyone has a mixture of parts. This isn't simply you're born gold, you're born silver, or you're born bronze. This is like everyone has a kind of everyone has a mixture, but also everyone has a prevailing part. Like everyone has a mixture of different gold, silver, bronze, but everyone also has an exceptional or distinguishing part at the same time. And the prevailing part is your nature, and the education and the social role which best forms that nature. So it becomes the task of society to observe the prevailing aspect in each person and let that form take place. And this forms the structure of society itself. So you have kind of potential. You have, like, you don't necessarily have a fixed nature, but you have a kind of a certain logic to the potential of each person, which we could say is something like their nature. And how that nature is cultivated in a society is the potential within this nature will take place and take its form. So is it a lie or is it an analogy to try, is it an analogy to keep a social order in harmony between, not necessarily like keep this person in that class and keep that person in that class based on kind of vulgar, material, personal, particular interests or anything like that, but is it an analogy used in order to try keep the correct balance between nature and nurture, or kind of energy and cultivation of that energy? And of course this is the Olympian distinction, which comes, in sports. Obviously we use, not just sports actually, other kinds of competition as well, but we still use this schema of like gold, silver, bronze. Of course the Olympians, the Greek gods were the Olympians. So it's not really a coincidence that this goes all the way back to Plato. And the cave, just as kind of side note, this presentation is not about the cave, but the cave is something which I would argue, if you read it, I should probably do a whole different video on this, but if you look at it, I don't think that these people are imprisoned in the cave. I think that they're being put there as a trial. I think the distinction between people's nature and how they are formed and then what role they should take up in that society is, and how we observe the prevailing part of their nature, is very much in the kind of I would say it's a trial. I would say that people are put in this cave situation in order to be observed, and there's shadows. There's people that shadow. They're not in prison. I mean, there's people shadowing on the wall. How do these shadows? Who are these shadow makers? How did they get there? They're not security guards. They seem to be doing a whole different thing. The idea is that the people that can tell the sun from the mere shadows is the people with the highest potential to become rulers, and that you can't really know this unless you kind of simulate that whole situation. Anyway, I'll do a different video on this, but the point is here, I think that Plato's Republic is very much, it's pedagogical. It's kind of radically pedagogical. Like it's not just like end of year exams in Plato's Republic. It's again, and I'm more and more convinced how influenced he must have been by Spartan trials of initiation were obviously pretty extreme, especially by modern standards, but even by the standards of their time. I think Plato's heavily influenced by that, and trying to form quite radical and what we would probably consider quite cruel methods of distinguishing people in order to put them in their proper place in society, in order to know their inner nature, or their potential nature, or their nature which gives them a certain range of potentiality which can be formed through education and cultivation. These are what we would today would be horrifically discriminatory and cruel, but I think this was just Plato's way of finding out distinguishing the men from the boys, if I was to put it in a kind of vulgar way, right? But anyway, maybe I'm wrong. The way of life of the auxiliaries and the guardians is very much about avoiding the corruption of private wealth. They're kind of high. Again, this is to do with their nature, their higher potentiality, and their superior strength. And I suppose we could take this in both the sense of ethics and physically, because they are the auxiliaries are a soldiering class who are militarily trained and so on. They're not the harm they could do, I suppose we could say, is greater than the harm. Although a lot of people would say the harm a commercial class could do is pretty fucking bad as well. But at least we're talking commercial standards by Plato's historical era. We're not talking commercial standards by whatever we're in. But I suppose their potential is greater, so therefore there's kind of extra care put into their cultivation so that it doesn't become corrupt. I mean, you can think of the way certain people in like the military, for example, or people in politics and government may have certain rules and standards of conduct imposed on them that you wouldn't if you're just like a business person, or you wouldn't if you're just like a normal private citizen. So there's this safeguarding of this higher potential and this energy within the auxiliary class, which needs to be taken with special care, let's say. So there's a kind of higher ethical standard for them than there is with others. There's also their relationship to appetite and desire, which again, to go back to the first installment of this presentations on Republic, there was the auxiliary, the guardian class emerge through the corruption which threatens a civilization once it reaches a certain point in which all material necessities are kind of met, and then there's this kind of excess to that. So there's a point in civilization where you get to a certain stage where the ability to accumulate more and more goods and then compete with your neighbors to accumulate more and more goods. We could say moving, and this is very much a theme alive in communism, or an ideology like communism. We're saying we're moving maybe beyond the primitive level of society to a kind of more civilizational level of society where the kind of routine sustenance to keep a society moving on a kind of minimal level moves into the excess accumulation of wealth and luxury, which becomes corrosive. And that's when in the Republic, it's here where this point is described, in which Socrates brings in this need for a guardian class. They're very much their role is very much to keep in check desire. And of course, if you go to Phaedrus and you look at the analogy of the soul with the horses, the chariot, and then the two horses, the white horse, which is spirit, its role is to keep the darker horse, which is constantly lunging at things, the object of beauty. Its role is to keep it in check. So again, you see this element of discipline and regulation of desire, and on a kind of more sociological level, a regulation of the insatiable appetite of material desire, luxury, and so on. Not just a regulation like the way some sort of modern bureaucratic institution regulates business conduct or something. We're talking about a kind of like ethical regulation on the level of the spirit itself, which means that their way of life would be quite ascetic compared to what we would compared to modern standards. It would be a conscious detachment from taking, wanting to, build up massive amounts of wealth and live in luxury and so on. So in this sense, education and the cultivation of this class is it's a form of kind of almost like psychological, psychopolitical, or even spiritual defense. So one quote from the Republic is, "So it is here in education that our guardians must build their main defenses." So just to flip it back into education again, and the cultivation of people within the Republic. Because the education is not just about exercising intellect here, but also about creating ethical, maybe the kind of more lingo that I'm kind of drawn to, psychopolitical defenses against something. What? Well, I would say fear and pleasure. I would say that the corrosiveness of material wealth accumulation, and luxury, and also fear. Because remember, this auxiliary class through which these guardians come, are also expected to be part of a kind of soldiering class who need to fight and risk death for their community. So it is fear and pleasure, which there's a kind of building up of a kind of sociological and a kind of psychological defense against. Training in this is very endurance based. Endurance based character is vital for Plato. So, for example, I wrote about this before. Lashes is a great book where you have this discussion of what is courage, and Socrates basically comes to the conclusion that Socrates is a kind of form of endurance. It's a form of endurance which knows when you should overcome fear, and when I suppose when it is acceptable to listen to fear. It's a sort of higher attunement to that aspect of ourselves, which must be cultivated to know when one should be scared and when one shouldn't be scared. We have a lot of warnings in the Republic against different classes. So, for example, doctors. If you go back to the part 1, there's a part on physical education I go over, where he warns against kind of like a society where doctors and lawyers. We've kind of discussed the kind of material, the commercial class of society, the dangers that they pose. But there's also things like doctors and lawyers. Doctors and lawyers come about in the Republic if they're given too much liberty and too much status, I think, as well. They're sort of seen as people who are just symptoms of a problem, and they don't really get to the problem itself. A kind of hypochondriac society who is constantly sick, and these doctors kind of come about as these kind of savior figures who can kind of chronically, it's very therapeutic, chronically help their ailments but can't really fix them. And the same thing with lawyers. Lawyers come about as people, and these are basically just like different species of sophists. This is what these are. This is what doctors and lawyers and commercial kind of leaders, if they're given too much liberty, and it's not that they shouldn't exist, but if they're given too much liberty, and if they take up too much status and too much role in society, they're basically just forms of sophistry. They don't get to the thing itself. They're just kind of symptoms. They just operate on this kind of surface level of symptoms. So a society is kind of unhealthy and sick because of much more complex reasons. And doctors come in not being able to fix that society, but they come in as an attempt to kind of like indefinitely fix chronic or therapeutically take the sting out of chronic ailments. They don't really get to the root of it. Solicitors are the same. A kind of society which is incapable of cooperation is going to find it, and also incapable of like of overcoming conflict or of like embracing conflict, to dealing with conflict in a way in which it's overcome or just cooperating. A society which is incapable of doing that is going to develop a massive industry of lawyers who kind of like speak on their behalf and get in these perpetual, long, drawn-out, bureaucratic legal battles over often petty things. Maybe sometimes they're not petty, but it's often petty things. So he sees these classes of people as just basically being in some way a threat, if they're given too much liberty. Not necessarily just their existence, but if they're given too much liberty. And this is basically under the theme that growth is only possible so long as it's compatible with unity. So unity is a key theme. Obviously, harmony of the soul is something which is thematic in the sense of unity, and unity is this kind of civilizational excess which you see come about. And historically, it would have made sense because ancient Greece became a quite successful higher civilization, and when you get to that stage, you have this potentiality of disunity, you have the potentiality of corruption, which needs to be dealt with and regulated. And you shouldn't have growth for the sake of growth, this is completely contrary to the logic of modern capitalism. But in the Republic, there's no growth without unity. And endurance and discipline of the soul is I think this defense against this disunity and this corruption. In this section, justice in the individual and the state. Obviously, we've gone over before the reflection of the three aspects of the soul and the three classes in the society. How does this defensive pedagogy fit the soul state analogy? Well, courage is described in 49C as a safekeeping of a certain sort of knowledge. This knowledge is in relation to the cultivation of understanding what is to be feared, and also a certain endurance of the corruption of pleasure at the same time. And retaining this knowledge, quote from the Republic, from Socrates, in all circumstances, I meant retaining it safely without losing it in pleasure or pain, desire or fear. The guardian class are the embodiments and educators of this ability to overcome the corrosive nature of too much indulgence in pleasure, fear, pain, and so on. So you may be asking is this just a kind of I can hear a little voice in my head right now of the modern urbanite shitlib, for lack of a better term, saying quasi-fascistic, love of unity for the homeland, and I don't know, discipline, glorification of honor, and so on. This has a metaphysical grounding, which is the point of this, and we're getting to it. This isn't just for the sake of, saying that we're tougher than our neighbors or something, right? Which is kind of what Victorian Britain was. Victorian Britain, this is a side note, I haven't planned to say anything about this, but Victorian Britain, for example, is a society where a certain kind of stiff upper lip, control, discipline was very important, but I don't think it was grounded in anything like ancient, this Platonic structure, of anything truly metaphysical, of anything truly leading towards something good or innate. I think in that sense it was a kind of virtue signal of their day, a kind of superficial form of discipline. A superficial form of discipline. I didn't plan to talk about Victorian Britain, but here we go. A superficial form of discipline, which, by the way, it's actually pointed out quite rightly by many people that Victorian Britain had the highest population of prostitutes per population per capita in human history. I'm just gonna turn the light on 1 second. There are, and I'm sure something similar could be said about Nazi Germany as well. But there are, of course, examples in history of a very superficial form of discipline, a very hypocritical form of discipline. But I don't think that we should be completely cynical, as so many people love to do. It's very cheap. It's very easy. It safeguards them against having to ever be virtuous or disciplined. To just say it's always projection. It's always hypocritical. It's always whatever. This is not the case. This is for Plato based in an extremely comprehensive kind of metaphysics and understanding of truth and so on, which we're gonna get to. So this aspect on mental conflict is extremely important. Reason needs spirit. So we're going to talk a little bit about, again, coming back to the theme of like, is this just discipline and restraint purely for the sake of it, or purely to kind of like look tough or something? No, reason, and I'm not obsessed. I'm not trying to like devalue reason or ignore reason here. I mean, reason in Plato is it is the spiritual hierarchy. It sits on top of the spiritual hierarchy. There's no arguing against that fact. Nonetheless, I think that this aspect of spirit is extremely undervalued and ignored, primarily because reason needs spirit, thymos, courage, restraint, in order to be in charge of these things like appetite and fear. Like, without spirit, which is described as a form of endurance, courage, restraint, pride, and so on, we risk fear, pleasure, destroying access, and this is the point, access, recollection. Think of Plato's, how do we encounter the forms? We don't calculate them, we recollect them. Forms, God, divinity, truth, I don't know, however we want to put it, right? There's many different ways we can, the good. There's many different variations and different ways we can talk about this thing, which is the highest point, the telos of the mind, or telos of the society, and so on. But reason cannot restrain appetite, and I forgot to put fear there, and fear alone. Reason without spirit, without these virtues of endurance, courage, restraint, and so on, without the cult, and not just the virtues of the cult, the embedded and somewhat militaristic, I have to say, cultivation of these aspects of the soul, the spirit, the mind, however we want to put it, is just calculation. It's just vulgar calculation. It's just kind of utilitarian, like calculation. It's reason without truth, we could say. So here's a quote, another quote from the Republic, which is quite good. This concord between them, as between these aspects of the mind, is affected, as we said, by a combination of intellectual and physical training. Intellectual and physical trainings. Crucial that we give knowledge where it's due to that physical side, which tunes up reason by training in rational argument and higher studies, and tones down and soothes the element of spirit by harmony and rhythm. When these two parts have been brought up and trained and educated to their proper function, they must be put in charge of appetite, which forms the greater part of each man's makeup and is naturally insatiable. So you also do have the role of reason controlling spirit, which can also get out of hand, and it can also get out of hand and be destructive. Like there's no denying that. But there's this interesting kind of like codependency or kind of mutual dynamic between spirit and reason, which they need each other in order to respond to appetite. You can't reason, even the interesting thing is that even though reason is on the top of the pyramid, the spiritual hierarchy, it is useless at fighting the most base aspect, which is appetite, without the help of spirit. Which makes sense when you think about things like, the kind of shame if someone acts, like if you think, take an example of like someone acting, or someone completely controlled by their appetite or desire, and they do things which are extremely destructive to themselves and to others, and you can't actually get to them. You can't actually say like, look what you're doing, like snap out of it. Just to take the addiction, just to take the example of addiction issues, for example, you can't get to someone and say, snap out of it, by just saying, why? Well, rationally listen to this argument. No, it's shame. They, at some point, they may or may not, and if they do, feel a certain kind of shame about what they kind of respond to an innate, intuitive understanding that this appetite is out of control and it's destructive and it's leading towards the destruction of themselves and to people around them and so on. And that isn't just access through reason and through rationality. It's access through spirit. That feeling, that emotion of shame, that is spirit. That is this side of the soul we're talking about. Reason needs that side in order to restrain appetite. So here's my hot take on this all, because I'm really sick of hearing people like academics and so on, somewhat therapeutically inclined academics who don't really let's say appreciate this aspect of the soul, of the psyche, in spirit, in endurance, in thymos, is that they often say that Socrates is a kind of physician of the soul. Physician means doctor, right? And I think we should reject this completely. And this is because if you actually read the Republic, like, the Republic is not a therapeutic society by any means. It sees psychology as in the attempt to create, because again, we see a lot of like modern psychologists say, see, Plato was a psychologist. He's talking about harmony of the soul and happiness and all of these things that psychologists talk about. He was just a psychologist. He was not just a psychologist. And the reason is, and he was certainly not a psychiatrist, but that's another kind of kettle of fish. He sees psychology as in the, let's say, life objective of kind of mental harmony, clarity, happiness, as the safeguarding of access to recollecting the forms. So remember, the point, the role of spirit, of thymos, why reason needs it, is because the destructive elements through kind of an addictive appetite of insatiable desire and of fear they block access to reason, to being able to direct itself and access this highest point, this form. So the spirited side of the soul is in many ways a kind of defense against these corrosive. It defends against these corrosive threats in order to allow reason to reach that part of the soul, because reason, with the intrusion of things like fear and a kind of addictive appetite of pleasures, cannot recollect the forms. So this requires a guardian class and the cultivation of the thymotic spirited side of the psyche. Guardian or auxiliary, and they're kind of one and the same thing in many regards, is not a physician, but they are those who can militantly remember. They safeguard against the forces of unrestrained appetite and fear, or a kind of virtueless intelligence, a kind of mere calculation, which would allow us to invoke intelligence without truth, or happiness without any honor. So that's my take. And militantly, because if you actually look at the Republic, this isn't like these aren't good schoolboys. That's what I'm trying to say. They're people that go through some pretty hardcore character development and building of, let's say, virtue, which would be, I would say, probably quite offensive to the modern sensibility of, education is sending little Timmy to, eat a packed lunch and, read, Moby Dick and, do a bit of PE and do a bit of math or whatever, then come home and watch cartoons. Like, this is not the kind of world Plato is occupying. So it would be quite a culture shock, I think, if we were to actually put a modern person within Plato's kind of like pedagogical infrastructure. That's my feeling on it anyway. So yeah, that's it. If you haven't subscribed already, subscribe. And see you later.